Hello everyone and happy Friday. I'm Nitsahone and I bring you a new Magic the Gathering Top 10 list each and every week. Today we're going to look at the 10 cards in Magic's history with Lifelink that have had the biggest impact. Lifelink is a rather powerful keyword ability because it allows creatures you have to provide twice the life point swing that they normally would, and there are some rather powerful cards with Lifelink in Magic's history. To be eligible for this list, cards needed to only do one thing, have the word Lifelink somewhere on them. This means that this list is not just creatures with Lifelink, but also includes cards that bestow Lifelink on creatures. Before we get started, a quick reminder for how I grade these lists. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they received, with a Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. I also count Vintage and Legacy Championship Top 8s as Pro Tour Top 8s, as those formats need to be represented in the scores of these cards as well. The cards in this list are arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. Cards with Lifelink that scored 10 or more points but didn't make the list can be found in the description below. Before we start, try your hand at guessing what the number 1 Lifelink card is in the comments below. Now, on to number 10. At number 10, we have Whip of Erebos, which is making its second appearance on an MTG Top 10. The first one was as the number 3 card on Top 10 Legendary Artifacts, and actually, this list has the most cards on it to have previously made appearances on MTG Top 10. In terms of Lifelink, it just barely made the list, showing you how many powerful cards there are involving the keyword. To be fair, Whip of Erebos wasn't primarily used because it granted your team Lifelink. It was sort of a gravy that came with the fact that it also allowed you to reanimate creatures from your graveyard and give them haste, but those reanimated creatures having Lifelink wasn't irrelevant. It bought you a little more time to use the whip again on your next turn, since your life would go up and you could take another hit from your opponent's creatures. Whip of Erebos saw all of its play in Standard, where it was a pretty dominant card. Early on, it appeared in decks that weren't completely based on reanimation, like Devotion to Black, Rakdos Control, Absent Midrange, and Orzhov Control, but eventually, the Whip came to be the name of its own archetype in Sultai Whip decks, which dumped creatures in the graveyard like Hornet Queen and then reanimated them. Hornet Queen was a particularly nasty example because you got to keep the 4 insect tokens no matter what. Once it rotated out of Standard, it never saw play again, as there are more efficiently costed ways of reanimating creatures in other formats. At number 9, we have Baneslayer Angel, our second card in a row with the previous appearance. Baneslayer Angel managed number 4 on my top 10 Angels list over on the Ether Hub, but only comes in at number 9 here. Once derisively called Wallet Slayer Angel because of the absurd price tag attached to it, this thing was one of the best creatures there were when it was in its standard format, and that format lasted a while because she was printed in both Magic 2010 and Magic 2011. She's packed full of useful keywords. She provides a 10-point life swing when she connects with the opponent, and that will be frequently because she has both flying and first strike, making her very difficult to block. Her protection from dragons was relevant too, as Broodmate Dragon was a commonly played card at the time, and she made him look pretty bad. While in Standard, she saw play in a ton of different decks, Blue-White Control and Bant Control among them, but then Caw-Blade emerged, one of the most dominant decks ever to exist in a Standard format, and she went along for the ride as one of the ways the deck had to win the game and put up absurd numbers. The most impressive perhaps being picking up 4 Pro Tour Top 8s at Pro Tour Paris in 2011. Eventually, steps were taken to weaken Caw-Blade with bannings, and while the Angel went untouched, she stopped seeing so much play without the powerful supporting cast. She saw some play in Extended too, appearing in Control decks and Zoo decks. After the demise of Extended, she saw play in the modern version of Caw-Blade, which got to keep living on for a while before bannings there eliminated it too, and in Esper Control decks. She hasn't picked up a top 8 since 2014 though, despite still being legal in Modern, and it doesn't look like she will re-emerge anytime soon. At number 8, we have Coil Engine, which is just a ridiculous card. I have sort of a personal story about the engine. I played Magic from Urza's Block until Lorwyn Morningtide, and then left the game for a while and came back during Return to Ravnica. I hadn't played for a while, and while creatures had been trending upward for a while, when I saw that Coil Engine was printed, it seemed insane to me. 6 mana for a 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink, and it makes 2, not 1, but 2 tokens, one of which has Death Touch and the other Lifelink when it dies. That's insane, and it showed me how much more powerful creatures had gotten. The engine is easily a 3 for 1 unless someone plays something like Path to Exile. Coil Engine is still an ultra-powerful creature, even with all the power creep going on, and it has a pretty impressive resume as a result as a multi-format all-star. It saw a ton of play in Standard, as it was one of the most obviously powerful creatures while it was there. It first appeared in Tezzeret Control decks, which were artifact-centric control decks, but it didn't take too long for people to realize the engine was just good in any kind of mid-range or control deck, and it started showing up in blue-black control decks that didn't even run Tezzeret. Probably the most impressive showing the engine ever had in Standard was at Grand Prix Brisbane in 2011, where it swept the whole Grand Prix, putting up 8 top 8s. These were in decks as varied as Green-White Aggro, Kessig Titan, Tezzeret Control, and Blue-Black Control. It wasn't legal for very long and Extended, as the format ceased to exist in 2011, but it did manage to put up 4 Grand Prix top 8s in its brief time there, mostly as a sideboard card in Fairies decks. It began its career in Modern similarly, but eventually found a mainboard home in Tron decks who could power out the engine on turn 3. While Tron has been its main home in Modern, it has also done some work in Scapeshift decks and made the occasional appearance in a Jund deck list. It has also managed 1 Legacy Grand Prix top 8 and has been powerful enough to pick up some high finishes in Vintage tournaments as well, with multiple copies of the card in the top 16 of the 2015 Vintage Championship, just missing out on a top 8. In short, Coil Engine isn't anywhere close to done putting up numbers and has a good chance to climb past some of the cards in front of it on this list. At number 7, we have a card that is still in Standard, Shambling Vent, the black-white creature land. Some have argued it is the best of the cycle of enemy-colored creature lands, and I'm not here to argue with them. A 2-3 with Lifelink is a pretty nice thing to have your lands become. It blocks well, races well, and dodges board sweepers. It has had many a home in Standard during its time there, at first appearing alongside Siege Rhino and Abzan decks, but later also in various incarnations of Dragon Control decks, Esper Control, Dark Jeskai, and most recently the various incarnations of Mardu vehicles. You get the picture. Basically, if you're playing a deck with black and white in it, in Standard right now, the Vent should be in it. It hasn't only made appearances in Standard either, as the upside offered by a creature land is attractive in other formats as well, and it has 2 Modern Grand Prix top 8s, the most recent one in April of this year, so more are probably on the way. At number 6, we have a card that only has Lifelink some of the time, but the fact it has Lifelink is pretty relevant. Westville Abbey and Ormondal have appeared on an MTG top 10 before. Last time we saw them, they managed to get to the top slot on the top 10 Demons list I did on the Ether Hub. Here, they only make it to 6, but that's pretty good for a card that's still in Standard. As a land, Westville Abbey has a leg up, as basically any deck that plans on putting a bunch of creatures into play in Standard is interested in running the Abbey. In the early game, it produces mana just like any other land, but in the late game, it can start churning out tokens, or it can also just transform into Ormondal. And Ormondal is an incredibly difficult to deal with creature who provides 18 points of life swing just with 1 hit thanks to his lifelink. The decks that have run him in Standard are exactly those decks that run a ton of creatures or ways to make creature tokens, such as Selesnya tokens, Abzan Company, Golgari Aristocrats, White Weenie, and most recently the Azorius Flash decks. The Abbey also has a lone Modern Grand Prix top 8, and because there's still a little downside in including this card in your deck, I imagine we'll see more of it in the future, even after it rotates. At number 5, we have our third card in a row that is still in Standard, Kalidas, Trader of Get, who also managed to get the number 2 slot on my top 10 Vampires list back in October, and he has actually put up enough points since then to claim the number 1 spot on this list, passing Olivia Valderin. Kalidas is an insane card for control decks. It provides a reasonable body with Lifelink, both things that aggro decks don't like having to deal with, and anytime a creature your opponent controls dies, he makes you a zombie token. He can then eat those zombie tokens if you want him to make himself larger, and the Lifelink can quickly make it so aggro decks have no hope against Kalidas. In Standard, he's done a ton of work, showing up at first primarily in control decks like Dark Jeskai, Mardu Green, Grixis Control, and so on. More recently, he has been showing up in Black-Green Delirium and Black-Green Constrictor deck lists. Kalidas has proven powerful enough to see play in Modern too, and has been showing up in more and more Jund lists, having put up 3 Grand Prix top 8s in the deck already, so I don't think it will stop putting up points once he leaves Standard. Finally, ending our stretch of cards still in Standard, we move to a card that rotated out a long time ago, but still sees a ton of play at number 4, and that is Vault Scourge. Phyrexian mana makes it so this guy is basically a 1 mana, 1/1 with lifelink and flying. On its own, that wouldn't necessarily be incredible, but he happens to be an artifact, and there are plenty of artifact strategies that love low-costed creatures and can make them bigger very efficiently, so usually when this guy hits you, he isn't just hitting you for 1. In Block and Standard, this meant running Vault Scourge with Tempered Steel, an enchantment that gave +2/+2 to all artifact creatures, and in Modern, this meant running it in Affinity decks alongside Arcbound Ravager and Cranial Plating, both of which can make the Scourge easily swing for 8 or more damage. Affinity decks have been a powerhouse in Modern for a while, and that is where the Imp has found himself the most effective. He's picking up tons of points every year, most recently a Grand Prix San Antonio in April, where he managed to get 6 Grand Prix top 8s. He is a potential candidate to be the eventual number 1 on this list if his rate of play continues. At number 3, we have Arias Charm. Like all charms, this can do a bunch of things, and to be fair, most frequently the other 2 modes of this card were used, but the lifelink part is used sometimes, especially against aggro decks where gaining 10 or more life is a bigger deal than bouncing their 1 mana 2/2. The Charm immediately saw play in Block, managing to put up 5 Pro Tour top 8s in Esper control decks at Pro Tour Dragon's Maze. It saw a ton of play in Standard too, again in control decks where the flexibility of the card made it incredibly good. It picked up top 8s in Bant Control, Esper Control, Blue-White Flash, Kessig Bant, and Blue-White Delver, but just straight up Blue-White Control decks is where it found most of its success. The Charm hasn't seen play since it's rotated, so the cards on this list that are still in Standard and seeing play in non-rotating formats will eventually pass it. But for now, it hangs on to the number 3 slot on this list. And at number 2, we have Soren, Solemn Visitor, who has actually visited 2 previous MTG Top 10s before, tying him with Spellskite and Hangerback Walker for the most appearance on MTG Top 10. Soren is a pretty powerful planeswalker. He can protect himself with a vampire token, and once the board is wide enough, he pumps your whole team and gives them lifelink. If your deck is built to go wide, that +1 can be game-breaking. The fact that Soren was in the colors of one of the most dominant decks during its run in Standard, Abzan, helped him out too. There were plenty of powerful cards in Standard for him to give lifelink to, like Siege Rhino, Fleecemane Lion, and Wingmate Rock. During his run in Standard, Abzan was just about the only place you could find him, and he definitely helped those decks become as dominant as they were. Soren hasn't done a ton in non-rotating formats, though for a while it looked like he might. He picked up a Pro Tour top 8 in a Modern Pro Tour all the way back in 2015 in an Abzan deck, but Abzan has all but disappeared from Modern since then, and Soren hasn't had a home. If decks running Lingering Souls make a comeback, though, you can bet Soren will be right there with them. And at number 1, we have Batterskull, who is so good that in my top 10 on a single card type, Artifacts, it managed to come in at number 3, but he takes the crown here. Batterskull really started seeing play after the printing of Stoneforge Mystic. The Mystic can tutor up the skull and then cheat it into play at instant speed, giving you a 4/4 with Lifelink and Vigilance on turn 3 without a whole lot of effort. The pair combined in one of the most broken Standard decks ever, Cawblade, the same one that Baneslayer was in along with Jace the Mind Sculptor, to dominate Standard for a time. Stoneforge Mystic and Jace both ended up getting banned out of Standard in June of 2011, but Batterskull continued on without them, still finding play in a variety of decks since his stats were so good and difficult to race. The primary place it saw play was in control decks, since it provided a win condition that was difficult to deal with and can put you out of range of aggro decks thanks to the life gain, but he still saw some play in aggro decks as the top of the curve threat. Batterskull also sees play in Modern, primarily in sideboards, as a good card against aggro decks where the life gain can make it difficult to finish you, and it also is a way for control decks and combo decks to side into a more creature-based strategy. The Skull has seen mainboard play in Modern, though, especially in Blue Moon decks, where it is one of the primary win conditions of the deck that it uses once it's locked the opponent out of mana. In Legacy and Vintage, Stoneforge Mystic is legal, and that means that Batterskull is an incredibly good card there, so it still sees play in those two formats as well, and in other words, Batterskull is probably going to hold on to the number 1 slot on this list for a very long time. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. In the comments, let me know what you thought of this video. Let me know suggestions for future MTG Top 10s as well. And if you want to make sure you catch my future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. You can also find even more of them over on the Ether Hub. Finally, my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic. You can head over there and build decks and test decks, and it's actually integrated between the app on your phone and the website now, which is really awesome. So you should check that out. And they also have a store where you can use my discount code NITSAHONE5 to get a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.